Right, so for my final project, I decided to do a Minute Earth video because I'm occasionally teaching grade school kids or middle-aged school kids about the environment around them. I chose the topic of ecosystem carbon balance and production because it's super interesting to me, and I hope to move my career in that direction at some point in the future. I'm also not the greatest at making animations or graphics, so um, this will be more of like a PowerPoint type thing. So use your imagination a little bit and we'll be just fine. So let's just hop right into this. So there's a lot of talk about carbon or CO2 in the atmosphere these days, and for good reason. The increasing amount of CO2 in our atmosphere is negatively affecting our climate, and we've already seen some of these effects. Many people are pushing for reforestation to help offset the amount of CO2 human activities give off every day. But how do these forest ecosystems actually help our climate? How do they fix carbon and where do they put it? As you're about to find out, it's quite complicated but very cool. Let's start with how the trees and plants take up CO2 from the atmosphere and turn it into carbon. This is called carbon fixing, and it begins with a famous process called photosynthesis. This, of course, is when a plant is taking in CO2 and water while using the sun's energy to store its own energy in the form of sugar called glucose. The other byproduct of this reaction is, of course, oxygen. Some of this carbon is lost in respiration, which is when plants use their newly made sugars for growth and release some of the CO2 back into the atmosphere. But generally, much more carbon is being taken into the plant than is being released. Now that the plants and trees have fixed this carbon, where does it go and what purpose does it serve? Plants seem to have an order of operations when it comes to carbon allocation and storage. First in line to receive that carbon are the leaves and buds. The reason that leaves and buds get special treatment is because they are the real breadwinners, meaning that they make all the energy that the tree or plant will need, as well as any reproductive functions like growing new seeds. A close second is new root growth because that is how the plant is able to pull nutrients and water from the soil. They also help keep the plant anchored into the ground. Third in line for carbon allocation is storage. Storing carbon can help a plant in times of stress, like drought or putting out new leaves in the spring. The carbon is stored in the canopy, the stem, and the roots of the plant. Fourth in line is growth of the plant, making it stronger and taller. Finally, we have defensive chemicals, like the tobacco plant. These are chemicals that some plants use to ward off pests. The tobacco plant is a great example because it releases nicotine into the soil, which is toxic to other plants, enabling the tobacco plant to grow with less competition. Now let's build this up to a larger scale. Forests are estimated to account for about 92% of Earth's terrestrial, or land, biomass carbon, but there are many different types of forests and ecosystems that use and store carbon differently. Tropical forests store the most carbon above ground at about 150 petrograms, while temperate forests store around 40 petrograms and boreal forests store around 20 petrograms. Carbon stored in the soil is a different story for these forests. Boreal forests store the most in the soil at around 200 to 350 petrograms of carbon, while tropical forests store around 110 petrograms and temperate forests store around 75 petrograms. How do we categorize how much carbon is being produced or stored at different scales? It can be very difficult to estimate carbon production because many external factors affect how much is produced and how it is measured. First, we can take a leaf level measurements of CO2 gas exchange and extrapolate the data to whole plant or whole forest level. This can lead to some inaccuracies as you assume that each leaf performs the same. Another way to categorize carbon production is from a larger scale that encompasses a whole forest, like gross primary production or GPP. As the name suggests, it is the gross amount of CO2 the forest takes out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. We can take this one step further to net primary production, or NPP, which is the gross amount of carbon produced minus the respiration from all autotrophs, or plants. Because when plants respire, they return CO2 to the atmosphere, which needs to be accounted for. Now let's take this another step further to net ecosystem production, or NEP. This includes GPP and NPP, but it also accounts for the respiration from heterotrophs, which include animals and microbial communities that decompose dead organic matter. But wait, there's more. We can take this one final step up to net biome production, or NBP. This occurs at a very large scale and includes each of the last steps we talked about, but it also includes carbon returned to the atmosphere by disturbances like fire or pest damage. So how do we measure these categories? For small-scale measurements, gas exchange chambers can be placed around a leaf or a small plant to capture and record all of the CO2 that is being exchanged between the plant and the atmosphere. Like we discussed before, this method is very accurate at small scales, but when extrapolated, it can cause errors due to differences in leaves, species, microclimates, and other factors. For large-scale carbon production categories, a method called eddy covariance can be used. Eddy covariance is used across the globe and can be a very accurate way to measure carbon exchange over a forest or ecosystem. These large towers are outfitted with sensors that pick up temperature, moisture, and of course, CO2 exchange between the forest below and the atmosphere above. Complex mathematical equations made multiple times a second are used to determine the actual CO2 movement between the forest and atmosphere. The final output from these eddy covariance towers is what's called net ecosystem exchange, or NEE. This is essentially the inverse of NEP, as eddy covariance measures from the perspective of the atmosphere instead of the forest. If we know what the NEP or NEE is for a forest, we can determine if the forest is a net sink or a net source of carbon. If NEE is positive, meaning that carbon is being released into the atmosphere, that forest is a carbon source. If NEE is negative, meaning that carbon is being taken from the atmosphere into the forest, then that forest is a carbon sink. But how does production change as a forest ages? If you've ever seen an old growth forest, you know it is much different from a young forest just by looking at it. As a forest ages, its carbon production also changes. Let's start by looking at how a forest changes over time. We call this forest succession, and it begins with the stand initiation phase, which is where tree seedlings have germinated and begin to grow as fast as they can. Once the trees become larger, they begin to fight for space, sun, water, and nutrients. Ultimately, this causes many of the small trees to fall behind, and the more dominant and faster growing species to survive. Once the remaining trees grow taller, an occasional large tree dies. Gaps in the canopy let in sunlight to the forest floor. This begins the understory reinitiation phase, where seedlings begin to grow into those gaps. As this continues, we hit the old growth phase, where there are multiple levels to the canopy in trees of all ages. Let's follow a line displaying GPP for this forest as it ages. As the trees begin to grow, their production is very high, and they are fighting to get a head start against the others. This production continues to rise until we near the end of the stem exclusion phase. At this point, the dominant trees establish themselves and the less dominant trees become suppressed and their production drops off or the trees die. This is where we see the lines start to drop back down before becoming almost flat in the old growth phase as the rates of production slow down as the trees get older. If we factor in respiration into this graph, we can see that it starts out increasing at a similar rate as GPP. Once the stem exclusion phase is reached, respiration slows down slightly as some of the trees die off. Before long, production increases again. Now, if we look at the shaded area between GPP and respiration, then what we have is NPP, because remember, NPP is equal to GPP minus the autotrophic respiration. So basically, younger forests are able to remove a lot of carbon each year from the atmosphere, which older forests aren't able to do. But these old growth forests store so much carbon, it is important that we don't disturb them so we don't release that carbon back into the atmosphere. I hope you learned a thing or two about ecosystem carbon balance and production. Now get out there and start sequestering carbon by planting some new trees.